Everybody to today's webinar on supervisor responsibilities in the steel industry. My name is Jack Minix and I'm a consulting services manager at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and I'll be acting as the host for today's Safety Connection. Before we get started, just a few notes on some webinar housekeeping. Firstly, computer audio is recommended and is best for this webinar. We recommend that you mute any other devices in order to avoid distractions. We'll be using the chat feature for all comments and questions. And finally, your microphone will remain muted throughout the webinar, and you will not have the ability to turn on your camera. You may send your questions to us at any time during the session through the chat feature. The chat feature can be accessed by clicking on the speech bubble icon on your screen. We will also have some time for a Q&A period at the end of this presentation for additional questions. You will have the option to view the content of the webinar in full screen mode. The full screen option can be accessed by selecting the ellipses or the three dots and full screen from the menu as shown. We'd like to make this session as interactive as possible for you, and we've added some poll questions throughout the session. Poll questions will appear on your screen and or in the meeting chat, as shown here. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send a message to us in the chat, which we'll be monitoring throughout the session. If you cannot access the chat, please respond to the meeting invite email that you received from Safety Connection. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First, Ted Balazs. Ted has been practicing health and safety in the province of Ontario for the better part of 30 years in various sectors, including manufacturing, warehousing and distribution, retail, and hospitality. Ted has managed and assisted in the development of health and safety programs for all sectors. Ted studied occupational health and safety at Ryerson University, and he's been involved with the Canadian Standards Association in participating in cross-functional teams related to the development and implementation of standards. Ted began his career at WSPS in 2012. In his first 8 years, Ted held the position of Health and Safety Training Specialist, delivering all programs, and currently as a health and safety consultant. Ted holds a passion for ensuring that all of our customers receive a rewarding experience in any solution that we provide. And now Don McInnes. Don is one of the Southwestern Regional Program Coordinators at the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. Don supports occupational health and safety inspectors by acting as a subject matter expert on the application of the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. He works provincially in a variety of committees regarding policies and procedures, Healthcare Provincial Program Advisory Committee, quality assurance programs, and issues specific to the industrial and the healthcare programs of the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. Please welcome Ted and Don. And Ted, I'm going to hand the steering wheel, the presentation over to you now. Thank you.
The steering wheel. Thanks very much, Jack. I appreciate that. And Don, thank you very much for sitting alongside me in the program. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Safety Connection session. I hope this is going to be rewarding for you in some way, shape, or form. What I would encourage you to do is, have some writing material beside you, because as Jack stated, there's going to be a Q&A afterwards. So, take some notes, any questions that you may have. I'm sure between myself, Don, and Jack, and everybody else, we'll get those questions answered for you. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So here's what we're going to talk about during the 1 hour session. We're going to talk about the foundation of health and safety in the province of Ontario, okay? We'll talk about the RACE process a little bit. If you're not familiar with that acronym, it stands for Recognition, Assessment, Control, and Evaluation. And then we'll talk about the internal approach to due diligence, okay? So these are 3 topics that we're going to cover. So I believe there's going to be a poll question that is going to come up in this, and there you go. It should have popped up on your desktop. So basically, how familiar are you with health and safety responsibilities as a supervisor? Not at all, somewhat, or very familiar. So if you would take a few minutes and just answer the poll. Okay. All right, so we got about a 50-50 balance here. All right, perfect. We got one other question for you too as well. Thank you for taking the time to do that. So the next one would be, do you know what due diligence is? Or how to incorporate it in the workplace? Oh, wow. Okay, so we got a fairly decent response of individuals that understand what due diligence is. That's a good thing. Okay, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I appreciate it. So the foundation of health and safety in the province of Ontario, okay? I brought my little green book with me, okay? I'm sure that everybody is familiar with this. This is the consolidated version of the book that we provide for all of our offerings. So this consists of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and where you see regulations, okay? Now, I'll kind of explain the difference between the two as we get going. The internal responsibility system, okay, known as the IRS, is the foundation of occupational health and safety in the province of Ontario, where the employer and the worker manage the health and safety within the walls of the workplace. If you have trouble or you need assistance doing that, there is the MLITSD, which is the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, there to assist you. There's the WSIB, the Workplace Safety Insurance Board, and then designated entities, which we are, which is 4 health and safety associations in the province of Ontario, okay? And then we'll talk about supervisor responsibilities as well. So, keep in mind, folks, that the Occupational Health and Safety Act is minimum requirement. Most employers far exceed the minimum requirement when I'm talking about things like, development of policies, procedures, how they incorporate, their health and safety management system and things like that in the workplace, okay? It assigns general duties and responsibilities to all workplace parties in most workplaces. Okay, so when you're talking about duties and responsibilities, just briefly, the Act consists of 71 different sections and 10 parts. Okay. And some of those relevant sections that we talk about, obviously, are sections 25, 26, duty of the employer. And you'll notice in the Green Book when you pick it up that the employer's responsibilities are the greatest because they have the greatest responsibility in the workplace. If you are a supervisor or you direct work at any given time, you should be familiar with Section 27. Section 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act outlines the legal responsibilities that a supervisor has in a workplace, okay? And then you've got Section 28, which talks about the duty of the worker. Contrary to popular belief, many, many years ago, the word on the street was that, well, the worker wasn't really responsible for anything. And Section 28 outlines the duty of the worker, and it's been there for a long, long time, okay? You can see the bottom note here highlighted in blue on the slide. So the responsibility to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. So this applies to the employer and this applies to the supervisor to take every precaution reasonable. So basically, what have you done to exercise due diligence in the workplace? And we'll talk about some of those things that you can incorporate a little bit later on. Okay. So safety legislation and standards in Ontario. So like I said, the Act itself is legal duties and responsibilities of workplace parties, okay? So some of the parts that we talk about too, when you talk about Section 54, Part 8, which talks about enforcement in the Act, this is powers of the ministry. So powers of the MLITSD, what the inspector's powers are, those types of things. And then you've got Part 9, which talks about offenses and penalties. Because if an employer, a supervisor, a worker, or any party is charged in a workplace, the court has a role, because now you got to go to court, you got to provide a defense. And this is kind of where it all blends into play. Okay. Part 4 talks about toxic substances and things like that. And then, there's different sections that talk about legal reporting responsibilities and whatnot. Okay. Sections 51 and 52 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And if I have some time, I'll get into that just a little bit later. But these are legal reporting requirements, okay, to the ministry, to the JHSC, the Joint Health and Safety Committee, and the Health and Safety Rep, or the Health and Safety Rep, whoever you have in your workplace. And if you're unionized, you got to report to the union too, but I'll cover that a little bit later, okay? And then you've got regulations. So regulations are specifics, okay? The most common regulation, Regulation A51 for industrial establishments, because under the definition of what an industrial establishment is, most workplaces fall under that definition. But then you've got, some apply to the type of work. So you got Regulation 213, which is for construction. You've got Regulation 67, which is healthcare and residential. And then you got Regulation 414, which is farming and agriculture. Okay. So like I say, a lot of the regulations are specific. And if I have time, like I say, towards the end of the program, I'll kind of decipher that for you a little bit. Okay. And then you have standards. Okay. So regulations are specific. Basically, it tells an employer what they have to do, not how to do it. So this is where the standards come into play. So you've got, if you've got industrial robots like pick and place units, robotic welders, and things like that in your workplace, you're going to follow CSA Z434. CSA Z432 is safeguarding of machinery and equipment. CSA Z460 is control of hazardous energy. So the hazardous energy standard basically comes into play when you're developing lockout tagout programs and things like that. And then we talk about codes and things like that too, because there's also excerpts from the Ontario Electrical Code and whatnot, things like that with lockout tagout programs. So there's a lot of different standards provide application in the workplace. Okay. And then you got the internal responsibility system. So basically here's the hierarchy of how it's built and how it's managed in the workplace. So employers provide the safe environment. So generally they're responsible for what happens in the workplace related to occupational health and safety, okay? They establish the health and safety programs and a policy. So generally you see a health and safety policy in your workplace. Under the Green Book, there's 3 requirements that come along with that. So the employer has to draft the policy, they have to review it annually, and they have to post it in the workplace. These are 3 requirements that come into play with that. Okay. And generally they're responsible for health and safety within the organization. Okay. And then you'll probably be quite interested in this particular piece here. Okay. Because when you talk about supervisors, like I said, which falls under Section 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, supervisors are to monitor the work, make sure that workers are trained to do their job. So they have to provide an element of training, and they have to educate workers on the hazards. So here's where I talk to supervisors about what is your knowledge level related to hazards in general, not only in your workplace, but in general, okay? Because there's 6 different hazard categories that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but there's associated hazards within the hazard categories, okay? So you have to evaluate this yourself. But one of the more important pieces talks about the employer when appointing a supervisor shall appoint a competent person, okay? And there is a definition for competency of a supervisor, okay, or competency, and it applies to the supervisor, okay, because supervisors delegate the work, they assign the tasks, these types of things. So you have to be competent in nature to do that, okay. You don't want to put somebody in an unsafe situation or something along that line, okay. So supervisors oversee the workers that do the work in the workplace, okay? Realistically, when you're talking about the definition of the worker, that definition has expanded quite some time ago to include a lot of different things. And maybe later on, I'll kind of give you a little bit of an explanation of that, okay? But workers have a duty to comply, okay? They have a duty to participate in any training programs, or probably the best way for a worker to participate in the workplace is become a joint health and safety committee member and get certified in the workplace, okay, and then bring concerns to the attention of the company. They've basically got a duty to report, okay, in most cases. Report hazards, report unsafe situations. You report to, a supervisor, a manager, a director, a CEO, whatever the case may be. Whoever it is your primary direct report. And honestly, this is a question that the MLITSD officers, when they visit the workplace might ask. Who do you report to? They'll ask some general questions to the workers on the floor and things like that on general inspections and those types of things, okay? If a worker doesn't know who they report to, that's going to be a situation that the MLITSD will address in most cases, okay? So general duties of the employer, and like I said, you'll find their legal duties in section 25 and 26, but employers must ensure that equipment, materials, and protective devices are provided, maintained, and that they're used properly in the workplace, okay? Now, that falls under section 25, subsection 1, clause A, but if you go to clause B, it says that the employer, with the equipment, materials, protective devices that they provide, shall be maintained in good condition, okay? Now, that equipment, materials, protective devices could be, machine guards, it could be personal protective equipment, it could be anything along that line, okay? Prescribed safety measures and procedures are followed in the workplace. Now, when you hear the term measures and procedures, this is what they're talking about, to make sure that it's carried out in the workplace, okay? They also have to ensure that the building is safe to work in and that it meets the requirements of the building code and was built with good engineering practices, okay? So anything along that line, when you're talking about documentation and things like that, you're entitled to. Roofs, ceilings are a big one, okay, in those particular cases. Section 25, subsection 2 talks about take every precaution reasonable to protect the workers, okay? But the clause actually, like I said, from the employer standpoint and the supervisor standpoint, take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. What have you done to protect the worker, okay? And then again, appoint competent persons as supervisors. Now, when you look at the definition of competency, there's different words in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, like and, or, will, shall, may, okay? This one here is connected by the word and, which means all three of these apply. Okay, so when you look in the definitions at the front of the Green Book, you're going to find this definition, and it applies to the supervisor. So basically is qualified because of knowledge, training, and experience, okay? Understanding the Occupational Health and Safety Act or the specific regulations pertaining to the work that they're delegating in the workplace, and has a good working knowledge of what the hazards are in the workplace or related to the work that they're delegating or assigning to the worker, okay? That is what makes a supervisor competent. So again, when you talk about competency and things like that, it is not up to myself or the other person or anybody else except the employer to ensure that you're competent in the workplace. But I also talk to supervisors, in a lot of the training offerings that I do throughout the year. You need to evaluate your competency, because if you find that you don't meet this definition, you realistically have to go to your manager, your director, whatever the case may be, and say, you know what, I need some more help with this because I'm not really sure that I meet this definition. So again, something to think about, okay, in most cases. The employer is responsible for preparing a health and safety policy, like I said, reviewing it annually and developing and maintaining the program, because the program and the policy are two different things. Okay. Help the committee or the health and safety representative carry out the duties and the functions and provide any reports. So, when you talk about the next one here, information, instruction, and supervision to workers and ensure that supervisors know the hazards in the workplace, the employer is responsible for educating and maintaining all of that. Okay. But again, committees and things like that, they're entitled to, hygiene reports, racking system reports, any kind of information. Usually committees uh, uh, evaluate, monthly incident reports and things like that. Okay. But again, a supervisor can take a big hand in that in supporting the committee. I always encourage supervisors, managers, make sure you know who's on your committee, maybe go to some meetings, tag along with them on inspections and things like that. Because honestly, the JHSC for a supervisor, they'll be your right-hand person. They'll be your eyes and ears out there when you can't be there, because obviously you can't be there every minute of the day. So your committee will be a working committee for you. Keep that in mind. Okay. Providing information in the case of medical emergencies or medical, sometimes if a person's being treated by a doctor, physician, whatever the case may be, they might call the employer and say, hey, does this person have any types of underlying conditions that, we need to know about, or anything along that line. And employ only those who are of legal age to work. Okay. And there's a specific when you're talking about minimum age requirement in a workplace. Okay. Jack, has any questions come across the board at all yet?
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, I've been monitoring the chat, and we don't have any questions right now. You're good to keep going.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
So duties of a supervisor, okay, and this falls under Section 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And like I said, if you're a supervisor or if you're a person moving into a supervisory role, I believe that this is very paramount for you. You need to understand what your legal duties are in the workplace, okay? But you can see the trickle down effect coming from the employer's responsibility to now where the supervisor, when they appoint the competent supervisor. So supervisors have a responsibility to ensure that workers work in a healthy and safe manner and follow the policies, procedures, and the law, simply because you've trained them on it. Okay. So when you're talking about policies and procedures and things like that, I mean, you're talking about standard work instructions, equipment inspections, pre-shift inspection prior to any type of equipment like machinery, fork trucks, Raymond reach trucks, anything along that line that they may be operating. So again, I always say, yes, the competency definition applies to the supervisors, but as far as supervisors and managers and individuals like that in the workplace go, you want to make sure that the folks under your direction are working from a competent standpoint too as well. Okay. It's very, very important that you follow that up and that you monitor that. Okay. They have to make sure that the worker uses or wears the equipment, the protective devices, or the clothing required by the employer. So normally, in most cases, when you're talking about, machine guards, personal protective equipment, fall arrest, anything along that line, cut resistant gloves, protective safety eyewear, anything along that line. There's an element when it comes to PPE, and it falls under Section 79 of Industrial Regulation A51. And this is what I mean about a specific, that if you're going to issue PPE to a worker in a workplace, you must provide training. Okay, so Section 79 talks about the training. Sections 80 to 85 talk about the personal protective equipment itself. Okay, so again, duty of a supervisor, they have to make sure that they wear the or use the protective devices in the workplace. Okay, take every precaution reasonable for the protection of a worker. So like I said, how have you exercised due diligence, or are you exercising due diligence in a workplace? In my opinion, I think it's very, very important that a supervisor documents everything. Okay. And like I say, the reason for that is because, with MLITSD inspections, they might ask for some notes or, documents or something along that line. So I think it's paramount that you have that in place. And like I say, the ministry inspections could be random. Most cases they usually are. But again, there's other reasons why the ministry would, visit the workplace, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later, or maybe that's a question you might have for the Q&A. Okay. Here's where it comes into play, where the supervisors advise the workers of any kind of potential or actual danger. So unsafe conditions, any hazards that might exist in the workplace, supervisor has to be aware of it, but they also have to advise the worker of it. So again, when you're talking about yourself, understanding what types of hazardous conditions might exist in your workplace, you have to communicate that. Okay. So this is where your knowledge level comes in paramount, having to train the worker. Providing workers with training and written instructions on workplace hazards and procedures to protect the worker where so prescribed. So where it says where so prescribed, we're referring to the regulation, which is specific. So things like ladder safety, personal protective equipment, lockout, tagout, how floors and other surfaces shall be maintained, racking structures, all kinds of different things like that. You're going to have programs and you're going to have policies and procedures that coincide with all of that. Okay, so it's paramount that you train the worker on it. Practical applications for certain things in workplaces. This is, prior to joining WSPS, I used to do this in my workplaces all the time, for lockout, tagout, for ladder safety, for all kinds of different things. WMIS, that's another one. So these are all areas where practical applications, specifically lockout, tagout, are paramount in a workplace, and supervisors can, be instrumental in helping to develop these, but obviously overseeing the whole process too. So, these are all things that kind of fall under the umbrella of due diligence when you're talking about all that kind of stuff. Okay. Who is a supervisor under the Occupational Health and Safety Act? Well, here you've got, foreman, if that's what you're called. We have managers, we have supervisors, we have team leads and lead hands. Okay. Again, the MLITSD has a description on their website. It's a narrative of, supervisors' duties, who is a supervisor, and things like that. Okay. But it basically, if you make, decisions or anything like that related to a worker, you're a supervisor. And I mean, when you're talking about things like rates of pay, bonuses, vacations, leave of absence, scheduling hours, and things like that, these are powers that a supervisor has. So, if you enforce procedures to protect the worker's health and safety, or you direct the work, or you assign the work, you're a supervisor. Okay. Honestly, to be honest, and I'm sure Don could back me up on this one, any inspector that ever came into a workplace, normally the first two people that they're going to ask for is a certified member of a JHSC to guide them around the workplace, or they're going to ask for the supervisor of the department because they may have some questions for the supervisors and things like that. Okay. Do not fear the MLITSD. They are there to help you. Okay. That's very, very important, because inspectors have a job. You have to respect the job. That's it. Okay. And that's what their job is to help maintain compliance in the workplace. Okay. So everybody always asks about this one. Okay. This is the first question. What's the fine? Okay. Now, when you're talking about individuals, okay, so an individual could receive a maximum, and this is the only thing that's maximum in the Green Book. Everything else is minimum requirement. Okay. So an individual could receive up to a $500,000 fine. Okay. Directors and officers of corporations, the maximum, 1.5 mil. And then when you're talking about corporations, this just rose last October of last year to 2 million per per charge. Now, with every fine that's levied in the province of Ontario, there's a 25% victim surcharge that's attached to it. And the employer is also responsible for paying that amount too as well. That money, from my understanding, goes into a provincial holding fund for victims of crime. Okay. So again, wherever the charge is, the municipality, that's where the money goes, right? But again, don't let this, misconstrue you or guide you or anything along that line. A lot of these maximum fines are kind of set aside for the more serious offenses. But again, this is the ministry's job. If they feel that a charge needs to be laid in a workplace for noncompliance and things like that, that's their job too. So, the ministry can also issue tickets in a workplace. I just want to kind of jump back to this a little bit because in the Green Book, there are areas, for the regulations and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They are set fines in the province of Ontario, and some of those fines reach $650 per offense. So there's fines for the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Industrial Regulation 851, Regulation 213 for construction. So again, if the ministry comes into a workplace and, they'll investigate first and ask questions before they lay any kind of a fine or a ticket or anything along that line. So keep in mind that's their job and that's what they do. Okay, for most cases. Race process. Recognition, assessment, control, and evaluation. Okay, so the foundation of health and safety, when we're talking about health hazards from a descriptive standpoint, health hazards have the potential to cause any kind of illness, disease, or any other health conditions. Okay. Safety hazards have the potential to cause injuries and things like that. Okay, like severe lacerations, fractures, broken bones. And when I was talking about the legal requirements, I just want to kind of refer to that briefly a little bit. So they fall under sections 51 and 52. Okay, because Regulation 420 describes what a critical injury is. It's critical injury definition, and the two coincide. So the critical injury definition is the specific, but the legal reporting requirements are in the Act. So Section 51 talks about death or injury. Okay. And this is where the legal notifications come into play, but you've also got a written report requirement to the ministry within 48 hours. Okay. And that one's divided into two different subsections. So when you go into section 51, subsection 2, it talks about a thing called preservation of wreckage. But what it means is securing the scene to make sure that there's no tampering of evidence or anything along that line, because there's going to be an investigation and the ministry will lead the investigation. Okay. And then you get to section 52. It's divided into two different subsections as well. So section 52, subsection 1, talks about accident, explosion, fire, or violence that causes an injury but nobody dies. Okay. And then you've got section 52, which talks about occupational illness. Okay. So both of those have all the legal reporting requirements too, to the MLI-TSD, the committee and or health and safety rep. And if you're unionized, you got to notify them too. But occupational illness as well under section 52, subsection 2, if it's deemed to be by a medical practitioner. And then again, the WSIB will get involved in things like that. The written report for that one is 4 days. Okay. So just briefly, if you want any more information on that, I mean, we could kind of discuss that at the Q&A at the end if you like. So common hazards in a workplace. So the top 4 that the ministry have identified in the province of Ontario. Number 1, musculoskeletal disorder. When you're talking about, force, repetition, awkward posture, sprains, strains, these types of things. Okay. Simply because of the claim costs that are associated with it, but the claims that come across the board, related to WSIB claims and things like that. Motor vehicle incidents, which cover everything from, cars, forklifts, dump trucks, anything along that line. I mean, if you're a company that has fleet vehicles or something along that line, it's going to be involved in that too. Okay. And this is, not only vehicles, but people being struck and things like that. Okay. Machinery and equipment, exposed moving parts, in running nip hazards and things like that. So just briefly, Sections 24 in Regulation 851, sections 24 to I think actually 38 talk about machinery and equipment. Talks about if you have exposed moving parts, you shall guard. Talks about in-running nip hazards. Talk about, barriers for projectiles that could potentially fly out of machinery and things like that. So again, e-stops talks about e-stops and all those different things. So just a little bit of information on that. And then of course, slips, trips, and falls. Okay. When you're talking about working surfaces, platforms, ladders, anything along that line, um, three different variations when you're talking about slip, trips, falls. You got fall on same level, which is, debris, cords, snow, ice, water, grease, oil, anything along that line, broken pallets, whatever the case may be. And then you've got, which I like to call, fall or jump to lower level. So when you're talking about loading docks, individuals jump off loading docks, they jump off flatbed trailers. Some will climb racking systems and they'll, have their hands occupied and then they fall off the racking system. So, and then you've got the infamous working at heights. So the working at heights program is a ministry overseen program too, as well. Okay. And then mental health. Mental health falls into this too, as well, generally, because, mental health, it's a pretty hot topic, when you're talking, and every workplace is affected by this. It doesn't really matter. When you're talking about things like abuse, violence, offensive remarks, bullying, things like that, stalking, cyber stalking, some of these types of things evolve into, criminal code contravention. So, this is basically where police, HR departments decide, hey, do we need to get the police involved on this one or whatever the case may be. But when you're talking about mental health, workplace violence and harassment, falls under Part 3.0.1 of the Act. And actually, violence and harassment became legislated June the 15th, 2010. So, it's going to be this coming June, it's going to be 14 years old. So, for an employer to say, oh, we didn't know or anything along that line, not really the case, right? You have to have a program in place, and the ministry will, look at your program, your training records, and things like that too, as well. This is a mandatory one. This is 100% of your staff. Okay. Some of you may have hazard assessments. I know employers do them a lot, in a workplace for all kinds of different things. But again, when you're talking about the process for hazard assessments and things like that, usually we use the RACE process. So the recognition would be identifying any kind of existing or potential hazardous conditions in your workplace, and then you have to assess. So when you're determining risk level, things like that, you usually assess to, legislation, codes, standards, guidelines, things like that. Once you determine whether there's a hazardous condition in your workplace or not, now you got to control it. Okay. So when you're talking about eliminating the hazard altogether, that's probably the most preferred method. But if you can't do that, then there's a hierarchy for reducing the hazard or the level of risk. Because what you're really trying to do is minimize the occurrence. Because when you're talking about, injuries that may happen to a worker, whether it's major, whether it's moderate, whether it's minor, sometimes that injury potential is going to stay the same. So again, what you're trying to really do is minimize the occurrence, the risk of occurrence. Okay. And then, of course, once you put a control in place, you want to evaluate. So normally when an employer puts a control in place, they'll say, you know what, we're going to monitor this a couple times a week for a month. If there's no recurrences or no new incidents that occur or anything along that line, it's pretty safe to say that the control that they're using or the control that they put in place is pretty effective, right? But that doesn't mean that you can stop the monitoring process. You just kind of reduce the monitoring a little bit, okay? So recognition, first step to recognize and identify hazards in your workplace, okay? How do we do that? Observations, obviously listening or speaking with the workers in the workplace. One of my more preferred methods, talk to the worker, talk to the person that actually does the job, because they'll be the one that kind of lets you in on, what the hazardous situations might be or what the issues might be. Okay. And then, of course, you got workplace inspections. These are the JHSC inspection every month. You've got audit processes and all kinds of different things in your workplace, potentially if you're certified, things like that. Okay. Hazard alerts or bulletins when you're talking about leading practice or best practice information. I'm sure you've heard that term before. And then, of course, something I mentioned earlier, review of your incident reports, first aid logs, things like that. We always encourage supervisors to review monthly incident reports. And the reason for that is because usually your incident reports will kind of give you a heads up if there's any kind of trend developing in your workplace. You can kind of catch it before something happens, like a lot of slips, trips, falls, or, so a lot of lacerations or something along that line. That's an indication that a potential might be there for an amputation or something along that line. So reviewing monthly incident reports makes very good sense. Okay. What other methods can be or are used to recognize hazards in your workplace? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay. So hazard categories, I talked about these earlier, the 6 specific categories. So you've got safety, which working at heights, so slips, trips, falls, machinery, when you're talking about lacerations, anything along that line, pedestrian, vehicle traffic, material handling, burns, electrical shock, things like that. Ladder safety all falls under this particular category here, okay? And then you've got physical. Now, when you're talking about physical hazards, everybody thinks physical, this kind of thing. But when you're talking about temperatures in a workplace, when you're talking about noise, which is classified as a physical hazard, vibration, when you're talking about hand tools, maybe driving fork trucks, anything along that line, over bumpy surfaces. And then, of course, radiation as well falls into this category too as well. When you're talking about chemicals, usually the use, the handling, and the storage, when you're talking about chemicals, kind of encompasses everything. But when you're talking about, solids, titanium, magnesium, things like that, liquids, which are solvents, toluene, toluol, acetone, this kind of stuff, gases, exhaust from any kind of machinery or trucks that are running that may be in your loading dock, these types of things. And then when you're talking about waste, chemicals inside machinery like hydraulic fluids, biocides, cutting fluids, if you're working a precision cutting process or anything along that line, these are all part of that. Outdoor bulk storage too, bulk containers, things like that. Sometimes you're storing totes and things like that in your storage areas. So this is a concern too, also from an environmental standpoint, because if one of those happens to get toppled or pierced with a fork truck and you have a release, these are all things that you have to be concerned about. Okay. Biological hazards, viruses. COVID did a great job on us, put us in a kind of a remission, I guess you could say, for about 2.5 years, something along that line. Bacteria, molds, fungi, fungus, noxious plants, and then pests. A lot of the summer times, because one thing that you really have to think about is, the building that's going on in the province, right? In the province, we've taken away the habitat of a lot of the animals and things like that, so now city streets, you'll see, coyotes, you'll see deer, skunks, rabbits, all kinds of this stuff. And usually in the summertime, we'll leave our, bay doors open or anything along that line, our access doors, and pests come in. So these are all things that you have to deal with, in a lot of cases in your workplace. Okay. MSD, forced duration, repetition, and static postures, constant standing, constant sitting, things like that. So people that do data entry, shipping clerks, people in offices that do all kinds of stuff like that. And then with the static postures with standing, I always use machine operators, things like that, because they're usually standing in one spot, hard concrete floor surfaces and things like that come into play. Okay. And then the last one, psychosocial hazards, right? When you're talking about violence and harassment, your organizational culture is key. If you haven't heard that term before, which I'm sure you have, your organizational culture kind of extends into the violence and harassment, where we respect, we got to give it to get it, these types of things. But not every workplace is the same. Okay. So, these are all things that you have to keep in mind about how your organizational culture is in your workplace. Okay. Heavy workloads can create stress. Shift workers. I used to have a lot of shift workers in my workplaces back in the day. If they're trying to maintain their work habits, but not only that, they've got families. They're not eating right, they're not sleeping right because they're shifting every 2 weeks and things like that. And sometimes that could be a little bit of a concern in a workplace. So, employers try to manage that, and supervisors can be a big part of this. Okay. Huge in most cases. Okay. The PEMAP tools. This is a fishbone diagram that we use in a lot of our programs from a hazard assessment standpoint. But what we look at is contributing factors that may contribute to accidents and injuries in a workplace. So we use the formula people, equipment, materials, environment, process. So things that we look at are what people do or do not do. Okay. And this is the decisions that people make in a workplace, or the lack of, can have a huge bearing on how things roll out. Okay. And this just doesn't include, workers. This includes, supervisors, managers, contractors that may come into your workplace, visitors, things like that. So you kind of embrace the whole thing. Okay. Equipment. Now it says here available, adequate, maintain. Have we got the right tools for the job? Is the equipment being maintained on a regular basis? Now, a lot of the times service providers will come in, depending on what you have, like fork trucks, cranes, any type of, presses, or, Raymond reach trucks or anything along that line. Usually service providers come in and provide annual maintenance and things like that. And then when you're talking about the maintaining it, are workers or supervisors able to identify when something is not working properly and it needs to be maintained, those types of things? So again, understanding the hazards that come along with that. Material, toxic supplies, is it a solid? Is it a liquid? Is it a gas? Is it heavy? Is it, do we have the right material for the job? These types of things, okay? The environment, usually things like poor housekeeping. We usually go down to the physical side of things, like for instance, temperature. A lot of times in workplaces that are not, climate controlled, anything along that line, hot weather in the summertime, condensation can build up the floor, which can create slip, trip, fall hazards. There's all kinds of different things that could occur. Dust is another one that we talk about. And then, of course, you got your process. Okay. Our tasks repetitive. Have we got, machine guarding requirements, when you're talking about pre-shift inspection, training the workers to make sure that all the guards in place, and all kinds of different stuff like that. So, and training is a big one under process because it's administrative. So when you look at all of these different things that kind of come into play with your process, these are all elements, and this is a good fishbone diagram that you can use to try to look outside the box, I guess you could say, related to hazardous conditions. Okay. Second step, you assess. So a hazard assessment is a process of evaluating any kind of unidentified workplace hazards to determine the extent and the severity. Okay. You compare against the law. Okay. So this being the law right here, standards, which are the CSA, and the ANSI standards too, because sometimes we'll use ANSI standards, which is our American counterpart. Okay. And then guidelines. So the ministry has a lot of guidelines on their website. We have them. Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety has them, CCOHS, for things like ladder safety programs, hot weather programs, these types of things, housekeeping programs. So these are all built kind of under a guideline, okay? And then you prioritize the hazards. Now, when you're talking about prioritization of hazards and things like that, estimating risk level. So I talked a little bit about this, right? Your probability and your severity determines the potential risk. So When you're looking at probability, how likely is it the hazard is going to cause injury and or illness? High, medium, low. There's a rating scale for that, okay? And if something were to occur, how serious would it be? Would it be major, which is critical, fatal? Would it be moderate, healthcare, maybe lost time associated with that? Or would it be minor, a first aid, okay? You estimate your risk level. How high is the risk level of the hazard? Is it high, medium, low? Now, there's going to be a thing in here called a hazard matrix or a risk evaluation chart. It's built into every hazard management tool, and it helps you define level of risk, high, medium, low, that kind of stuff, right? But when you're talking about probability, how likely will the hazard cause injury and or illness? High, the injury and or illness due to exposure to the hazard is very likely. And then there's a rating scale for this, usually in your hazard management tools that you have in your workplace. So as supervisors, if you haven't seen your hazard management tool, ask the question because I think it's good that you understand what it is, but also ask if you can take part in the process, okay? Medium, there's a chance that it might occur, and then low, the hazard will probably not cause injury, illness, anything along that line. And then you've got the severity. So when we're talking about major, moderate, minor, hazard could cause fatal, injury, illness, anything like that, or damage, property damage, okay? Long-term disability, significant loss, anything along that line. Where moderate is, it could cause moderate injury, like I said, lost time, a healthcare incident, something along that line. And then minor, the hazard could only cause minor injury or illness without any kind of loss. So this is usually your first aid. That little graphic up there in the top right is the risk evaluation chart. So again, this is built into every hazard management tool. So it kind of gives you the rating scale, whether it's high, immediate action must be taken now. Where medium is, it's important to take action, but we've got a little bit of time to do it. Where low is, general maintenance or something along that line, we can fix it right now. So that's what the hazard matrix does for you, okay? Jack, I want to reach out to you one more time. Is there any questions that have come up that we can?
Nope, Ted, I've still been monitoring the chat. There's no questions yet, so you can keep going.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jack.
Yep, no problem.
So controls. Once you recognize, once you assess, now the employer is responsible for putting a control in place, okay? So the control is how you're going to eliminate or minimize the hazard. Eliminate is our most preferred method if we can, okay? Sometimes we can't do that. So we got to look to minimize. But like I said, what you're trying to do is minimize the risk of occurrence, okay? So there may be legislated or regulatory controls for the type of work or workplace. Now, when you're talking about the regulations in here, this is what we mean by regulatory controls, okay? So seeing if something refers to it from a compliance standpoint, but using the standards to provide application. You can always call the MLITSD, for, advice and things like that. This is where we come in too, because at our organization, we've got general consultants, but we've also got machine safety, we've got hygienists, we've got ergonomists on staff, all kinds of stuff like that. So you can basically go to our website. You can, call or you can email, and you will get somebody that answers the call, and they'll direct to the specific area related to your concerns and things like that. So this is where we can come in and assist you. Okay. So controls. Now, when you're applying controls must adequately control the hazard, protect all workers who are likely to be exposed. And then there's a thing called inherent risk, not create any types of new hazards or anything along that line, okay? The hierarchy of controls that you see here, elimination, like I say, our most preferred method, but then you go all the way down the line, personal protective equipment, probably being our most method that we want to use. That's going to be our last resort in most cases. I don't like to use that term, but again, PPE. Now, sometimes with controls, you might use two different controls, or something along that line, okay? And an engineering control plus personal protective equipment, okay? Not all controls are effective as others. Your last piece is going to be evaluating. So evaluating how well the control does its job. You go back to the assess, you ask, is there any kind of regulatory controls or anything along that line? If there is, you maintain them or you incorporate them, okay? Identifying any new hazards, if any, as a result of the new control that you put in place. And this is why we always say revisit hazard assessments or anything along that line, because while you're incorporating new processes and things like that, you may create new hazards. So this is why it's always wise to revisit. And then we get to our final piece here. We talk about the internal approach to due diligence. Now, I've covered a lot of this previously, but I'll talk about a few other steps that we want to maintain, okay? So defining due diligence, making sure that you take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the workers. So do workers have that same duty to take every reasonable precaution? They do not. It doesn't state it in their legal responsibilities, but again, as supervisors, you would like to make sure that all of your workers are competent in what they do, because that's due diligence and that's reducing risk as well. Okay. Always encourage the people that report to you. If you're unsure, take a step back, ask me the questions, and we'll figure out a solution. Okay. In most cases. So costs, and we use the musculoskeletal in this particular case. So when you're talking about direct costs and things like that related to any kind of injuries that might occur in a workplace, you got WSIB claims, return to work programs and things like that. You're responsible for managing the claim. You got prescription costs, replacing, retraining workers. If you don't use job rotation, that might be the only person that does the job, then you're stuck. Home care, we talk about prosecutions with fines, and then of course, surgeries and things like that a worker may have. These are all things that we take into consideration, okay? When you're talking about indirect costs, obviously pain and suffering, I will tell you flat out, the pain and suffering to the victim is the most direct effect if they live to tell about it, stress, stress of the family, stress in the workplace related to accidents and injuries, things like that. Company reputation, if the media gets a hold of it, look out, okay? And then low morale, accidents and injuries create a very low morale in a workplace, and these are things that we want to avoid, okay? Fines and penalties, I talked about these already. So this is basically a duplicate slide of what I talked about before. And then, of course, the criminal code. So many years ago, there was a thing called Bill C-45, and it was in relation to an incident that happened near Westray, Nova Scotia, where there was an explosion in the mines. 28 workers were killed, and corporate officers, senior directors of the organization felt that they weren't responsible. But Bill C-45 actually was passed through legislation, and it became 217.1 of the criminal code, which applies to everybody who undertakes or has the authority to direct work, requires prevention of bodily harm from any work or task. Okay. So again, when you're talking about criminal charges and things like that, objective evidence, and this is where I, always caution supervisors, document everything. Even if you have a conversation with someone, make a little note, anything along that line. But when you're talking about objective evidence and things like that, due diligence has to be demonstrated and recorded at every step. Okay. So when you're talking about factual evidence, it's based on facts. It includes details. It is specific and observations, not opinions. It's based on what we saw. Okay. Where documented, documented processes, dates, times, actions that are taken, who's responsible for incorporating the action, and then who was involved, timelines, and then of course any kind of disciplinary action that may be taken or something along that line. Okay. if I comply with all parts of the act, will I meet the test of due diligence? Maybe, maybe not. Keep in mind it's minimum requirement. Most organizations go above and beyond. Okay. The internal approach to due diligence, okay, when you're talking about, policies, procedures, education, monitoring, these types of things. There's legislation that kind of incorporates this, providing information, instruction, supervision, policies and procedures, sections, that refer to the company policies, procedures. Your employer would have to consider the legal requirements, including any codes, standards, guidelines, things like that. So, what I encourage supervisors to do, um, you know, in your Outlook calendar, or kind of book, if you're not familiar with your policies, procedures, and things like that, book something in your Outlook calendar and read them, especially when it comes to, legal responsibilities and, these types of things in a workplace, legal requirements, roles, and responsibilities, just to make sure that you understand um, everything that is to be incorporated in a workplace. Okay. When you're talking about the supervisor, the education, the training, the compliance, supervisors are responsible for an element of training. This could be monthly safety talks. This could be all kinds of, different things, maybe training on a policy procedure. And this is why I say you need to understand it first before you can train a worker on it. Okay. But when you're talking about, compliance and things like that, your health and safety management system, I'm sure your employer provides training for you too as well. Okay. Workers have a duty to follow the rules, report hazards, and things like that. So, when you're talking about education, could be generic training. Sometimes we do online training in a workplace. We have an application for that too as well. But training can also be specific hands-on, hands-on training, practical applications. I'm a firm believer of those for sure. And then, of course, monitoring, which is your inspections, your observations. And then, of course, corrective actions. The ministry looks at this on documentation when they come into a workplace. How have you incorporated this? Who's responsible for carrying out the corrective action? That kind of thing. Due diligence examples, enforcing and following the rules, encourage hazard reporting by everyone in the workplace, communicating about your health and safety practices and things like that in a workplace, taking steps to correct hazardous situations, and consistency with discipline and things like that. Okay. Keep in mind that the ministry considers progressive discipline a control, because what you're trying to do is actually correct a behavior. Okay. In most places, right? So what are you doing to actively demonstrate? All of these different things would be considered due diligence in a workplace. Training, verification, always talk to your committee, orientation, training records, things like that, job specific for workers, your workplace inspections, toolbox talks. There's all kinds of different ways and means with this kind of stuff. Okay. Due diligence strategies. So the act, and this is what I encourage supervisors to do mostly, understand the act and the regulations, specifically your legal responsibilities and things like that. Your company, know your company's policies, procedures. And this is why I say, if you get time, book it in your Outlook calendar and just kind of review, your policies, procedures. Communicating the rules to the workers. This could be part of your monthly safety talks or weekly safety talks. Supervisors often tell me that they do weekly, toolbox talks and things like that. And then training, be involved in new worker orientation, job specific. Two mandatory trainings. One is workplace violence and harassment. And then the other one that the MLITSD mandated July the 1st, 2015, that all workers and supervisors be trained in basic occupational health and safety awareness. Okay. So these are all things that are mandatory. Okay. And then, of course, you got audits, inspections, your inspections by the committee. Supervisors, in my opinion, should be doing random spot inspections, go on the Joint Health and Safety Committee inspection, tag along, that kind of thing. Okay. That's all due diligence. So your commitment to due diligence, when you're talking about internal resources, all employees have the right to certain information. And then the employer has to post the MLITSD Health and Safety at Work Prevention poster. And then external resources, you can go to our website. For the ministry, the WSIB, WSPS, CCOHS, you can sign up for newsletters and things like that, which will give you great sources of information. If you go on our website too as well, we have regional conferences. We can come in and provide training in your workplace and things like that. So basically go to WSPS.ca and look around our website and contact one of our folks at WSPS, and they can provide more information for you as well. And here's how we can help. We've got health and safety program development, consulting, development of programs, confined space, machine safety and robotics, occupational hygiene, and then of course, all of the training. We provide cert for JHSCs, accident investigation, construction courses, all kinds of different things, workplace inspections. And if you like, I will put my email address. .ca. For any of you there, you can contact me if you like with any information that you need or anything along that line. And that is it, folks. I hope this was rewarding for you. I want to thank Jack for being my moderator and Don for sitting in too as well. I guess that's it for me, Jack. If you'd like to offer anything specific.
Sure. Thank you, Ted. And
you're welcome.
Just inviting the group to type any questions that you might have in the chat. I thought maybe I could kick it off with maybe a question to Don. Don, if a ministry officer arrived at their workplace, how would the visit go? How would they interact with your officer or your inspector? And what questions might that inspector ask at a workplace if they did visit?
So every inspector is required or should be introducing him or herself. They should be telling you that they're with the Ministry of Labor. They'd be presenting some sort of identification like a business card. If you wish to see more, then you're more than welcome to ask to see their badge. They're required to state or provide the reason why they're in the workplace. So if they're there to do a proactive workplace inspection, they should tell you that we're here to do a proactive. There's a provincial initiative going on. This is the reason why we're there. If they're there because of a complaint, whether it's an anonymous complaint or a verifiable complaint, which means the complainant has left their name and number, they'll tell you that, right? They'll ask for somebody who represents the employer. So either the employer, a manager, or the management member on the Joint Health and Safety Committee. And they'll also ask for a worker representative, whether it's the health and safety rep, a Joint Health and Safety Committee member, or if they're not available, if it's a unionized workplace, they'll ask for a union member, somebody that represents the workers. And then they'll go on and they'll discuss. I always used to ask, if I was never at that workplace before, are you familiar with the Ministry of Labor? What our role and duty and responsibility are? If they're not, I'd provide a short little bit of information on that. We do compliance, we do enforcement. If they're familiar, we sort of skip that. And then if we're there for a health and safety complaint, we review with the workplace parties the reason for the complaint. Well, actually not the reason, but what the complaint is. And if it's one or two items, we'll go through one or two items. And then if it's something that they need to go out and look at on the floor, for example, then the worker member, the health and safety rep, will go with the inspector. The management member, whoever represents the employer, is always more than welcome to attend. And we'll go out and we'll look at say it's an unguarded machine. We'll look at the machine. If it's not guarded, we'll have a discussion, and then because it's a contravention, we're going to end up writing an order to guard it. But the inspector should be having a discussion is how long do you need to guard that piece of equipment, or how long do you need to correct that contravention? And then if it's a reasonable date, I always said, you know what, we can work with that. And then I would write the report. If any of the allegations that are listed in the complaint, we'll go through each one. If they're not true, we'll put that in the report. We'll say, we went out and we looked at the machine ABC, and at the time of the inspection, it was observed to be guarded. We'll put that in our report. So we'll put, if you're required an order, we're going to write you an order if it's an imminent hazard to a worker. If it's something that, say, your health and safety policy is out of date, or your violence policy has been reviewed, then we'll do a compliance commitment where the employer will commit to reviewing it, sharing that with the committee and the health and safety rep. And that way we get compliance. We don't have to write an order, and it's sort of like an education and awareness for that workplace.
Great. Thanks, Don. Ted, I don't know if you can navigate back to slide 28. Sorry, 28.
Yep.
Somebody had a question regarding shift work concerns, and maybe wondering if you have any suggestions to assist employees regarding shift work.
Yeah, so I mean, related to shift work, I mean, I can basically tell you what I used to do. So, and again, it really depends on what the concerns are related to shift work and things like that. Shift work can be comprehensive, and the reason I say that is because we're all not alike. What I used to do way back in the day, and this is way long prior to joining WSPS, I used to get, I'd call up like maybe my local health unit, and I'd bring like nutritionists in. They would do safety talks on usually, and like I say, it was volunteer, or we'd give them some money for a donation or something along that line. But they used to do safety talks like on nutrition, how to balance your diet, while you're working shifts and stuff like that. But then they also talk a little bit about sleep habits, and things like that. I mean, it's really, really tough to balance, you know, shift work and things like that, because like I say, we're not all built the same. Our systems don't function the same. But healthy eating, healthy sleep, these types of things, trying to make sure that you maintain those things are good habits, I guess you could say, to get into.
Yeah.
Don, I don't know if you've ever kind of dealt with anything like that from the ministry standpoint, but if you'd want to offer anything in relation to that.
No, I think it was put in the chat that the EFAP programs are a great way to deal with that. We really don't deal with shift work.
Yeah. But again, when you're talking about sleeping habits, when you're talking about eating, balanced eating and things like that, those are good habits to get into. I mean, EFAP programs can help with the shift work discussions. That's for sure. But again, that's what I used to do. I used to bring, nutritionists in to do safety talks and things like that, just to try to help incorporate, drinking lots of water to make sure that you're hydrated, these types of things. It all helps.
Yeah, those good suggestions. Thank you. Ted, I wonder if you're a supervisor listening to this presentation. We've had some really nice comments and thank yous from participants.
Mm-hmm.
If I step back as a supervisor and I want to gauge my own competency as a supervisor, what would you suggest? Like if I walk away from this presentation and I want to just do some reflection and think about, am I a competent supervisor? What would you suggest they do?
First thing I would suggest, look at the definition, because when you're talking about knowledge, training, and experience, what is that? Okay, so this could be, some certifications from courses that you've taken in the past. This could be, supervisory role that you've held in a workplace or prior workplaces for a long time. And then when you talk about experience, your element of training, because I look at the second part of that too, when it talks about, understanding the hazards and the legislation that goes along with this kind of stuff. More knowledge with the Green Book. People often ask me, how do I get better with this? Keep it in your hand 5 minutes a day. Look up something in the act under a duty responsibility. Look up something in a regulation that might be specific. But I always encourage supervisors to take courses. And like I say, some of the courses to get more knowledge on the Green Book. Because realistically, when a supervisor, and I ask a lot of supervisors, what's your level of knowledge from 0 to 10 related to the Green Book? And most of them say it's really minimal. Make sure that you understand Section 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, because that's legally what you're responsible for in a workplace. Think about maybe taking the certification course for joint health and safety committees, even though you're not going to be a committee member, because it's all of the elements I believe that a supervisor needs um, to conduct a role effectively in the workplace. And
Yep.
through that training, you will gain a level of competency.
Don, when an
Yeah.
inspector coming into a workplace, how would they look at those things similarly to assess if the supervisor is competent or not?
So when we go in, and this is for investigations, or we're there for proactive or reactive. If a worker is injured and we're able to interview that worker and that co-workers, and there was a hazard that caused the injury, and I'll use the unguarded machine again as an example. Did you report that the machine was missing a guard? Yes or no? And the worker will probably say, yeah, I reported it. I reported it to the supervisor. And then we'll talk to a couple of other workers, and they said, yeah, we've reported to the supervisor also. So then we would have an interview with the supervisor, and we would really basically ask two questions initially. Were you aware of the hazard, or was it reported to you? And the supervisor in most cases is going to say yes. And then the second question is, what did you do about the hazard? And this is where we're starting to hold supervisors responsible, in the sense that it was reported to me, but I didn't do nothing because I didn't know what to do, right? So there's a lot of education. Well, you should correct it, or you should report it to somebody who can. And when you mention the criminal code section, Bill C-45, we're seeing a lot of police services become involved now, especially in workplace fatalities. And when we're having meetings with them, and they issue us a production order where we have to turn over our investigation to them, they'll ask us, well, the supervisor admitted that they were aware of the hazard. So we've seen that you recommended charges against that supervisor. Say, yes, that's what we do, because if the supervisor failed to take that information and act on it, then there's a liability. And police services are always more than happy to jump on that when they're pushing the criminal code section there.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I agree with that, Don, 100%, because if supervisors say to the ministry, well, I didn't really know how to correct the hazard or anything along that line, this is where we encourage, maybe getting higher levels of management involved, to get some help and things like that, because there's all kinds of resources, internally or externally. So you ask the supervisor, did you talk to a higher level of management that might have some experience with this?
And where we get to see this is in the Section 52 notices that are applied to the committee and to the union. And what we're seeing on the notices where it's steps to prevent reoccurrence, we're finding that the employer is putting things in there that were already in place prior to the accident or the event, and not steps to prevent reoccurrence. And then when we sit down and we talk to the committee and the union, this is something that they should be looking at. What steps since the event has the employer taken to prevent or reoccurrence, so it doesn't happen again? And if the information isn't there, that should create a discussion amongst the committee to go back to the employer and say, well, we had this in place, but how are we going to prevent it from happening again? So we need steps. So it creates a discussion, a dialogue. If the employer does put steps in there, it allows the committee to look at those steps. Are they reasonable? Are they achievable? And if they're not, then they need to have that discussion again. Or if they are achievable, when are we going to be able to put them in place so we don't have the same accident again?
Right. Yep.
Maybe one last question, Ted, before we sign off. a big part of being a supervisor is managing workers, obviously, right? Directing workers and the work. What tips might you have to help supervisors better manage the worker to ensure that they understand what their health and safety responsibilities are?
So one of the big ones, realistically, build a relationship with your workers. You know, a lot of the times you'll hear in workplaces that, you know, workers have a, you know, a fear of repercussion for reporting and things like that. That's not part of that organizational culture that we talk about. So I always talk to supervisors about building relationships with the people that report to you. So there's never a fear of reporting or anything along that line. They should be able to want to come to the supervisor to report these types of things. Training. When you're talking about training for the worker in all aspects of whatever they're doing, and the practical application piece, I think personally is critical. You know, have the worker demonstrate what, you know, how to do this in the workplace, so that if they're not, you know, up to speed on anything, or they're maybe doing something a little bit incorrectly, the supervisor can correct it right then and there. To me, those are two really paramount things: building relationship with the worker and making sure that they're trained adequately.
Great.
Yeah.
Anything to add there, Don, or do you
Um,
concur with
yeah,
what Ted is saying?
yeah, exactly. They, you know, WSPS or the other safe workplace associations always reach out to them when you have questions. If an inspector has been in and you develop that relationship with him or her, you're always more than welcome to pick the phone up, give the inspector a call if you have questions. We have a occupational health and safety call center. There are live people on the end of the phone. You're always more than welcome to ask questions. If they can't answer your question, they will escalate it, either to a regional program coordinator or a telephone advisor. And we also have the WebOps email on the Ministry of Labor website, where you can send an email to us, you can ask your questions, and then somebody will respond back to you. And we rather have questions asked than having to come a couple weeks later because there's been an incident or an event that wasn't addressed.
Thank you. There's a few things in the chat, a few questions about getting a copy of the presentation. It's been answered, but we don't share copies due to copyright, but we do record this session. We have recorded it. Everybody that registered will receive an email once the recording is ready, and then you'll be able to download that, watch it again, share it. There are a couple of links in the last few chat windows regarding our upcoming series for the steel industry. So this was one of 3 sessions for the steel industry. The next one is being held on May 13th regarding material handling. And the one after that will be in June regarding lockout tagout. So those links to register, it's all free. Registration, self-registration links via the website is in the chat. So thank you to Hazel for putting that up. And then on the screen that is, yep, sorry, thanks, Charmaine. I got the dates mixed up. I knew the 13th was there somewhere. May 16th and June 13th, that's correct. And then this last slide that Ted has up is the contact number and email for WSPS. As Don and Ted both said, please reach out, ask us any questions. There's you can call us, or there's a contact form, and we'll make sure that somebody gets in touch with you. Otherwise, you will hear from us once the recording is ready. And I'm going to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm going to thank our speakers, Ted and Don, for joining us as well. Wish you all a safe and pleasant weekend, and we'll see you hopefully on May 16th. Thank you.
Thank you.